right. Okay.
Yes.
I meant to ask you this earlier. Is it Sestanovich?
You got it.
Okay, cool. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out. This is a wonderful crowd. Yeah. Nice. Thanks all for joining us tonight. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. We are so excited to have Clare Sestanovich and Alexandra Schwartz with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Clare's debut novel, Ask Me Again. But before we get officially started, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First up, we will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Claire will be around to sign and personalize your books at the alcove where currently drinks are being served. So we'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And finally, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of Ask Me Again online using the link in the live stream description. Okay, now let's get into this. We all came to know and love Clare's poised and perceptive prose from her short story collection, Objects of Desire. And now in her debut novel, she whisks us into the lives of Eva and Jamie as they grapple with their identities and their destinies. We can't wait to dive into the plethora of questions at the heart of Ask Me Again. So let me introduce you all to tonight's writers. Clare Sestanovich, named a 5 under 35 honoree by the National Book Foundation in 2022, is the author of the short story collection Objects of Desire, a finalist for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize. Her fiction has appeared in publications such as The New Yorker, The Paris Review, and Harper's Magazine. She lives here in Brooklyn. And as I mentioned earlier, Alex Schwartz joins Clare in conversation tonight. Alex is a staff writer at The New Yorker and a co-host of the magazine's Critics at Large podcast. She has been awarded the National Book Critics Circle's Nona Balakian Citation for Excellence in Reviewing. I hope I said that correctly, but here we go. Please join me in welcoming Clare and Alexandra.
Thank you all for coming. It's lovely to see so many familiar and friendly faces. I'm going to start. Can you hear me? Well, great. Everyone can hear me. I'm going to start by reading a bit. And I'm going to start at the beginning. But that's the end. In a courtyard behind the hospital, with cold metal benches and leafless trees strangled by Christmas lights, Eva came upon a doctor smoking a cigarette. He sucked on it hungrily. He exhaled out of the side of his mouth and glared at her, defiant, adolescent, as if daring her to point out his hypocrisy. She was the actual adolescent, 16 years old. She could have told him that she enjoyed hypocrisy. No, not in herself. Her own contradictions made her seem strange and ugly, like dressing room mirrors that revealed angles of her face she couldn't usually see. But in other people, inconsistency was interesting, a mark of complexity, maybe maturity. She smiled at the doctor. He crushed the cigarette under his shoe, an elegant pivot with an inelegant sneaker, and went back inside. You weren't supposed to like hospitals, but secretly Eva did. She liked being close to so many extremes. Birth, death. It was surely the cleanest place she had ever been. Surgeons, she learned, scrubbed their hands for 2 to 6 minutes, all the way up to their elbows, and also the dirtiest. Blood, shit, infectious disease. She timed 6 minutes. It was a long time. People yelled in hospitals and people whispered. They limped or they hobbled or they sprinted from one emergency to the next. She had watched a man fall asleep standing up. There was good news and bad news. Miracles happened, but sometimes, a lot of the time, life simply dealt you a bad hand. Whenever she heard an ambulance approaching, Eva went toward it, not away from it. She stood right next to the automatic doors of the emergency room, longing to cover her ears and willing herself not to. It would have been easy to block the sirens out, but she had recently adopted a new ethic, too new to be violating already. Block nothing out. If she listened long enough, close enough, the wailing of the trucks became an urgent pulse inside her body. While her grandmother slept in a semi-private room, a pale green curtain separating her from a carpenter who'd fallen off a ladder and broken his back, Eva wandered the halls in search of characters. In the basement, radiology, she found a woman in a plastic chair clutching a jagged chunk of rose quartz in each hand. In her lap, a pile of other crystals, amethyst, obsidian, tiger's eye. On a floor with a view all the way across Central Park, cardiology, she found a man singing union songs while wheeling an IV up and down the hall. Which side are you on? He belted, then hummed, then belted again. Yours, a doctor rushing past assured him. Through an open door in the pediatric wing, she found a toddler wearing a styrofoam helmet. His parents argued loudly while he stared at the television, a soap opera on mute. Abruptly, his mother changed the channel, and a dour newscaster appeared. The child smiled placidly as grim headlines scrolled across the screen. Then there were patients like Eva's grandmother Adele, who seemed too empty to be characters. Vacant stares in the waiting room, haggard faces in the cafeteria. The elevators were packed with people who didn't want to look at you. But of course, they had stories too, all the more alluring for seeming blank or being hidden. She brought these characters, these puzzles, back to her parents. She meant it as a kind of comfort, someone else's story to distract from their own. Adele wasn't unconscious, but she wasn't exactly awake either, and no one could say when or if she might be. The doctors, with their unreadable expressions and their unknowable expertise, with sentences so complex they might as well have been secrets, blandly instructed them to wait, cryptically promised they would see. Eva's parents were not very good at waiting. They paced, they grimaced, they clenched their hands and jaws without noticing they were clenching. Her dad was better at it. He had his sketchbook, the rhythmic sound of pencil against paper, like an animal scratching plaintively at the door. Eva's mom kept buying things from the vending machine at the end of the hall, packages that had been there for too long, crackers crumbled to dust, chocolate white with age. She opened them and then abandoned them, forming a pile on an empty chair, as if stockpiling for some future disaster. Adele was in the hospital because she jumped out the window at her nursing home. It was a second-floor window. She hadn't died as she'd hoped she would. Her bones broke in lots of different ways, her right kneecap into many pieces, her lowest rib neatly in two. Her pelvis had somehow remained intact, spider-veined with cracks like the surface of a melting lake, but her ulna had pierced straight through the skin of her forearm. By the time Eva and her parents arrived at the hospital, it had been pushed or pulled back into place, reset. For nearly her entire life, from Krakow to Boston to the assisted living facility in New Jersey, the village they called it, Adele had been a devout Catholic. She gave God credit for everything, beseeching him desperately, thanking him profusely. She had never insisted on anyone else's devotion. Eva's father, her son, hadn't been to Mass in decades. Eva's mother could be haughty in her non-belief, but their ingratitude had worried her and brought her pain. Then, a few months before she jumped, all that had changed. With a suddenness that seemed biblical, her piety had turned into rage. Why had everything been taken from her? Her husband, her driver's license, her bladder control, one friend after another. Then the house. She had given her life to that house. She had given other people lives in that house. 3 children, 6 grandchildren. She raged instead of eating, raged instead of sleeping, raged into the phone long after she had accidentally hung up. The doctors had explanations for the anger, tangles in the brain, something called plaque. The explanations made her angrier. She was not one of those old people. She was not confused. She was furious. She left a note beside a dish of spearmint lozenges before she jumped, dated in wobbly handwriting no longer recognizable as her own. December 3rd, 1906. Later, the doctors used this against her. She was 100 years off. In the note, Adele's anger was not personal or petty. That might have made things simpler. That kind of rage might have been easier to refute, or at least to ignore. She didn't call her children traitors or cowards, which made them realize that's what they were. It was the world, she said, that had disillusioned her, God who had betrayed her, and not just her. She could have tolerated that. Who was she, after all, to be spared grief and humiliation and incontinence? But what about the others, the young, the beautiful, the not yet disabused? What would happen to them?
Hi, Claire. Hi. I'm so happy to be here. I just have to say, because Claire and I had coffee last week and we were just really careful not to talk about this book in any way. So the mystery for me has only been growing for the last 7 days and all my questions have been percolating, and now I get to pin you down, and it's very thrilling.
Pinnable, yeah.
Yeah. So we just met Eva.
Yes.
Eva's the protagonist of this novel, and over the course of this novel, she's going to grow up. She's 16 when the book starts. She's going to go to college. Spoiler alert, she's going to graduate from college and begin her life in her 20s, which is not quite the same thing as your adult life, but sort of close, and then move into her adult life.
Yeah.
So what I want to know is how you originally conceived of Eva, what kind of person she was to you, and who she became as you were writing her.
Yeah. So I did crucially think of her first as a 16-year-old, very much. And I think because the degree of her openness and uncertainty about the world felt like the starting point. She's not naive. She's very self-aware and observant and critical, but there's a certain, I don't know, there's a fine line between naivete and extreme openness or something. I don't know. She has not quite, she's deeply flawed and confused. And so I think that combination, whatever I was trying to evoke, felt easiest to tap into because she was 16. Like that's we know that part of being 16. And some of those elements are very much going to persist into being a 24-year-old. But I think I needed to start with it in the raw adolescent state to then see what was going to happen. And I think part of it is, she is plagued by self-doubt in a way that is developmentally appropriate, I think, for a 16-year-old and becomes increasingly less so. And so I think trying to watch her figure out how to shed that or not shed that became part of the project of the book.
Did you have a sense of where you wanted her to go, or were you discovering as you wrote along with her?
No, I really never know, for better and for worse. So yeah, it was really along for the growing up. Right. I mean, I had a sense she was going to graduate from college, but no, she and this book took many different forms. So she was not always, she goes and works at a newspaper. That was not always the case, or I certainly wasn't sure about it. I wasn't sure how long she was going to last there. Neither was she. So I do think that there is, and we can talk a little bit more about this, but I think that Eva she's a readerly character in a way that I hope is, like helpfully implicates readers. But she's also, I don't know, the uncertainty that she experienced as a teenager is not so dissimilar from the uncertainty I experience at least as an author. We're figuring out how to write the story. So there is a sense of alignment there, I think.
Okay, I really like that you just said that she's a readerly character, because first of all, I want to know what that means. And second of all, I've been thinking of her as a writerly character. And I think all of you who just heard the first part of this book, one thing you can see is that Eva is a noticer. And she really, I would say that, especially at 16, one of her big points of identity is her noticing, her ability to notice. There are moments where she's kind of moving too fast or going through experience by her own lights too fast, and she tells herself, stop. And there's this great double negative you use at one point, like, don't not notice, something along those lines, which she tells herself. So she wants to look and notice. And that's a quality, like when we're praising writers, we often say, like, what a great, they note, like, this novelist notices so much. Look at all the noticing. We love to say that about novelists and writers.
Yeah.
And here's a character you can say that about. So what, in short, does it mean for her to be readerly? Is it possible that she's also writerly?
I think definitely possible. She no, she's definitely in the, Jamesian mold of someone on whom nothing is going to be lost. She even brings this up later on in the book. Someone has praised her for, being someone who doesn't miss a thing. This is a point of pride. And well, maybe we differ on how we think about pride, but there's an Achilles heel element to this, I think. And to be a noticer is also to be always on the periphery and to not be, willing to take certain plunges, to have an ambivalent relationship toward, more intense forms of conviction and involvement in the world. And so I think that her readerliness or writerliness, whatever literary quality it is she has, I think is also an impediment to self-realization in a lot of ways. And so I hope that readers feel an identification with her in the sense that you will also be observing this world in some ways through her eyes. It's a close third narration. But when I said implicated earlier, like there is something very discomforting about her ambivalence and her refusal to give in to certain forces that are operating in the world around her and on her own life. And so that's part of what I think sometimes when we praise narrators for being, having certain literary qualities, it means like, you should really love this narrator. Like we're on their team. And I think in this book, not to tip my hand too much, but you're not fully on her team. So I guess that's where I come down.
Okay, I feel a little absolved because I really like Eva, and I want her to do better than she's doing. Like, I really want her to get off the sidelines, as you say, and enter life. And one thing that's so interesting about the way you've written your book is that in some senses, we're kind of watching the story of a late bloomer, but before anyone knows that she's a late bloomer. So like a lot of late bloomer stories begin with, the like virgin who's 40 years old and like he's 40 and a virgin. So you can imagine what's happened in the previous 20 years. But here we're starting with a 16. A little bit about Jamie. Who is he, and how does he function how did he function for you as a kind of counterpoint to Eva?
Yeah. So Jamie is a rich kid from New York, and they meet in this hospital. Their paths otherwise would not probably have crossed, though, many things can happen in New York. And he has a pretty adversarial relationship with his family, about whom we don't learn too much. And he really gloms on to Eva and her family when they're teenagers, and then this friendship persists but also begins to wane as they go off to college and enter young adulthood. And yeah, I think of this book as being about magnetism in different ways, what it is that draws people together and sort of the different ways of being in someone's thrall. And I'm curious how it struck you, but Eva and Jamie are not obvious best friends. This is not you don't meet them in the waiting room of the emergency room and think these are soulmates. But there is something that is that really compels each to the other. And yeah, I kind of found myself also just drawn to them in this somewhat inexplicable way. And so the inexplicable nature of the friendship and the force of friendship itself became for me a character in the book and a thing to explore over time.
Yeah, I mean, the book is called Ask Me Again, and each chapter title is a question. And sometimes the questions relate directly to something that happens in the chapter, and often they don't, or they could, but at a kind of oblique angle. And, you know, there is this conversation of a kind happening between Eva and Jamie. And what I wanted to know was, what for you was the purpose of the questions? What role did they play for you in the writing and in the making of the book? What do you want us to get from them?
Okay, so the questions, and there isn't actually like a table of contents, so you couldn't like flip to.
Should we give some examples of the questions?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to flip.
You're gonna have to flip.
I'm gonna have to flip. Okay, here's a question. What's it like? Here's another question. Should we get started? I'm flipping. Okay, here's a very good one. What's the point? So these are, to give you guys a sense, like, these are kind of the big questions of everything. What's the point is kind of the biggest question of all of them. Maybe.
Yeah, although honestly, in assembling this list, you keep thinking, oh, here's the big one. And then there is another. The questions were an extremely intuitive choice for me as a writer, which is not something that happens that often. And I went with it because it did feel organic to a certain spirit of the curious spirit of the novel. I think, I guess I would say that Eva and Jamie, I imagine them as having very different approaches to many of these questions, as you've maybe got a flavor, have potential to be extremely ordinary questions, you know, voiced one way, and deeply, you know, profound existential kids talking after philosophy seminar type of question. And that is sort of very intentional, I guess. The idea that there is this slippage between mundane and profound, maybe even divine, is very, I think, important for both Eva and Jamie. But they have very different orientations toward question asking, I would say. I think Eva is the sort of character where, like, she's just waiting for someone to ask her exactly the right question. And the idea is, if only someone will do that, then everything will fall into place. You know, the answers will come into view, life will be sorted out. I'm just waiting for that person. Which has all kinds of troubling implications for, you know, how we think about agency and interiority and whatever. Jamie, I think, is more, he's the asker. He's got lots of questions and he really doesn't want to be asked them himself. He's a deeply private and sort of intentionally opaque person a lot of the time. So I think to the extent that they have a shared interest that brings them together as friends, I think it is like interest itself. They're deeply curious people, but the curiosity as a vector is pointing them in very different directions.
Oh yeah, I really like that. Yeah, it's in some ways it's almost like all these questions which we get continuously throughout this book. You kind of sometimes you wish, like, if only they could ask each other directly.
Yeah, but they can't. And yeah. Well, I don't know. Do you think they do ever?
Yeah, I do think they do sometimes. You know, there's this one thing I love about this book, and there's so many things I love about it, but one is like the real sincerity of inquiry behind it, both in the writing of the book, but also in the way that the characters approach life. And Eva and Jamie are really different characters, as you've all just heard, but they're both very sincere about questing for something deeper in life. And I think that is at the root of a lot of problems for them both, but those problems may be, you know, that may be worth the struggle if you can get to the answer on the other side. But I did notice, and I wonder again if this was intentional and what you think about it generally, that a lot of the times that you do get questions asked between them and you do start to get to some of the stuff, the conversation is broken off. It's almost like they can't sustain whatever that would be to kind of go there with each other?
Yeah, I think that their intimacy does have a sort of asymptotic quality of like constantly approaching and never. I don't know if it's because they're not sure what they're trying to get to, or it's a sort of fearful avoidance of like what will happen if we actually answer the question. I do think like part of this is realism of like I think there's so many conversations you have where if you just eavesdrop at people on a cafe, like every other question goes unanswered. People are just talking in a different direction. So it's sort of true to conversational cadences, but also, I don't know, do you ever actually get the answer to these big questions by asking the big questions directly? Maybe for some people, but I think, you know, their stating of the question is as much a like expression of desire that is important for them to mutually acknowledge as it is like an investigative quest in that actual moment. Like I think to the extent that they ever arrive at the answers or ever will beyond this book, it's going to be through much more oblique means. I don't know. This is also a bit my bias as a literary minded person. I think anybody who's readers and writers, we think like, oh yeah, the oblique way is the way, kind of. And there are some people in this book, like, you know, a pastor comes to mind, who really do not share that belief, who are like, we can ask these questions directly and find the answer.
And the answer is Jesus.
The answer
And we'll get back to that in just one second. I want to put this book in time. I want to get a little more concrete. When we're talking about questions, we're talking about these big things. There are certain, you know, you mentioned realism before, and you write a very certain specific kind of realism. We can absolutely imagine who this person is. You tell us in some ways a ton of detail about her. She's an only child. Where are my only children? Are we in the house? Thank you, one person. Oh my God. Oh my God. Okay, then we really have to talk about only children because the rest of you don't know. She's an only child, and she's from middle-class Brooklyn, and has lived a kind of like pleasantly cloistered life to some degree. But we also start to see her as part of a generation. And one of the first ways we do that is because Jamie, her friend who we've been talking about, gets involved in Occupy Wall Street. So suddenly we can place them in time. But you don't call it Occupy Wall Street. So this is something that I've noticed in a lot of books.
Yeah.
People love to sort of say the thing that we all know what it is. You know, I'm thinking even of my very dear friend and podcast co-host, Vincent Cunningham, talking about the candidate in his book, Great Expectations, about Barack Obama. So, and I first noticed it was Zadie Smith a while ago, and I was like, she's talking about The Wire. Like she's like the TV show, the prestigious one about the drug dealers in Baltimore, and it's like, it's The Wire, I think I know that. So I really like this effect, but I only know it as a reader.
Yeah.
What draws you to it as a writer?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because it does not, there are many things that feel intentional to me about my writing practice. And this one doesn't really. I think, I mean, it may mimic something that I am trying to produce in readers, but it almost feels to me when I'm writing that if I were to pin things as concretely as you describe, if I were going to name The Wire, it would like take a bit of the playfulness or the room for experimentation would get sucked out of it in some important way. Now, in some cases, it's more important than like there is a TV show in this book that is basically the TV show Love is Blind, but I've never really seen Love is Blind, so I don't think it really is. I mean, I've seen one episode. I can kind of say. So
you researched. Let them know that you did some research.
Yeah. So, and what I'm interested in there is the premise, and then I want to be able to take whatever liberties I want and create an entirely different TV show. That's fine. But I think there is something about, I don't know, it's important to me as a writer to know that it's still fiction, and it's important that readers experience it that way as well. And
I don't know, realism for me is not like, oh, let's really pretend that Eva is a person you could encounter out there in Brooklyn. I do want that spirit of experimentation to come across, and maybe this is one way that I'm channeling it. I don't have a really satisfactory answer. It is very intuitive. And I probably should have a better one, but yeah, it's interesting to me that it's an organic. Well, I guess the fact that it's organic, it could also be avoidant. You know, like I don't want to get too pinned down as here I must be, but I don't know. Is that persuasive to you?
I mean, it's interesting because I'm starting to formulate my own idea about what maybe is going on in part, because this is an interesting trend, I think, and it has like a very, first of all, kind of beautiful aesthetic effect where nothing ruffles the surface because you're not like suddenly like, oh, that's this thing I know. You're kind of putting it together, you're piecing it together in your head. But I also think, okay, I'm just thinking of this on the spot.
Yeah.
So you can also tell me if you think this is, I don't know, like anything, or maybe it's nothing at all. But there's a way in which when you don't name something like by its proper name, and for instance, there's a character in this novel there is a candidate. It's
There
not
is a
Barack
candidate,
Obama.
yeah.
It's not AOC, but it's also like not AOC.
Sure.
It's maybe AOC adjacent is what I would say this character is.
Yeah.
Do you think that's fair?
Yeah.
Yeah, AOC adjacent with some key similarities and with some key differences. But I think almost like there is a way that life and the literary inform each other, obviously for a writer, but also for readers, and you know, probably for all of us in this room to some degree or another, where the way that you narrate life to yourself in your head, and this is the kind of character who Eva is, as you narrate life, if you're that kind of person, it can sometimes become like a conscious narration, and you're thinking of, how would I describe it in the book, and how would I find the language? And it places you as a character in your own experience. And so in a way, there's something very literary about going through the world and taking off some of the newspaper-ish, you know, ripped from the headlines kind of specificity. It's almost like she's turning real life, in a way, into the book, and then we get it in the book and have to turn it back into real life. Yes, no, or maybe?
Yeah, no, I think I buy it. I mean, I think when you're a critic, to take a possibility, and you know, you're reviewing The Wire, you gotta say The Wire. And in part, it's not just because it's necessary, it's also that you want to call upon everyone else's experiences of this shared cultural artifact, right? Like you're going to be sharing your opinion about it, but you also are, you know, you're trying to bring people in, you're welcoming their experience of The Wire as well. Maybe there's some quality in fiction where, in fact, I want you to bring a little bit of your experience of AOC, but I also want you to be leaving room that, in fact, what is most salient and important for you to leave room for is Eva's experience of it. And I don't know, maybe we're saying versions of the same thing.
I think we are, and I'm excited by it. Yeah, because I think we are saying, well, maybe, yeah, similar things, right. And in part, I love that around something like Occupy Wall Street, which is fundamentally a collective political movement, but becomes, when you know, kind of efface some of that specificity, like an event that's happening in the life of this character. You know, she sees it as something that's happening kind of outside the realm of experience that she's curious at looking at. She's not participating in Occupy, Jamie is,
right?
Unsurprisingly, because he's the one who's kind of after a collective in action. She's the one who stands a part of it. Yeah, so there's something that kind of puts it in the realm of narrativized art and takes it out of the political. The reason I'm asking about this, among other things, is that politics is actually really big in this book. Eva is involved with this guy, I'm gonna roll my eyes at that guy, who goes into politics. I won't say too much about that guy, so you guys can discover him for yourself. But he goes into politics, and then, as we mentioned, there's this other character, a young, very charismatic female politician from New York City. Why did politics feel like something that you wanted to bring in?
Yeah, I mean, so Eva is drawn to these two particular characters, and we could even, to some extent, maybe put Jamie in this category as well. But people for whom this bridge between, you know, people who really believe in things, people who really do things, people for whom that bridge between believing and doing seems fairly straightforward for them. And that whatever that bridge is like pretty rickety in Eva's life. So I think part of it is it's very easy for her to idealize and to feel like, oh, here are people who have answers, and I just need to follow the path. Like, I'll walk across the same bridge as them. Now, for various reasons, there are going to be things that hold her back from doing that. But you know, whatever realm of sort of abstraction that she is often lost in, I think they present very genuinely compelling possibilities for tethering things back down to reality. And I think it's also worth noting, you know, both of these characters are people with progressive politics who are very much, you know, radicals who are both working within and against an institution. And I think that Eva is not somebody who temperamentally is a radical. And I think the possibility of kind of like having it both ways is especially seductive to her. So I think that's one thing she's navigating in her relationships with, you know, there are two of these characters who are, you know, radical, but like working within the frameworks. And then there's Jamie, who's kind of like, fuck it all. And there are various different branches of a path that she's figuring out her relationship to, I think.
Yeah, along with politics, which, right, as you're saying, offers this one kind of sense of the possibility of action in changing the world. Religion, as you mentioned before, is another one. I was really interested to discover in your very beautiful essay that you wrote and that the New Yorker published last weekend, that religion has been something that you've been interested in your own life. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that and how that informed religion in the book. And we're talking specifically about Christianity.
Yes. Yeah, this is Christianity in the book, and it's a particular version of it, which is like a highly personal, God is somebody who is in your life and someone you can have a conversation with, and is certainly providing an overall sense of coherence, but is also, you know, someone you can chat with, essentially. And it's also this is the Christian left. These are like, Jesus is a community organizer, and very compelled by the kind of collective spirit that I'm certain people encounter in lots of different churches, but that's very central to Jamie's church in the book. And where am I coming at all that from? I've spent my entire life in extremely secular environments, feeling in many ways totally aligned with those values, and in many ways a sense of like, oh, something is missing here, and wouldn't it be nice if I knew what that something was. I actually, my mom this past weekend sent me a variety of juvenilia that included a book. It's some school assignment, but it included, to my surprise, a sentence, this must have been from 5th grade, that said, I believe in God and all his doings in the world. Which is not something that I've ever said since. I was surprised to find that they're recorded. So yeah, I mean, in some ways it's very simple, right? Like, faith is an answer for so many people in life. I think it is, I don't know, Eva has a very ambivalent relationship toward this church. Jamie has a much more, he's all in. And I did want to explore in sort of her aversion to it, different ways that people, I think she's very fearful of a little bit of what we were talking about earlier, the kind of total candor and directness with which certain big questions can be posed. She's very sincere and willing to do it in certain contexts, like philosophy class, like a political debate, and once you get it in a sermon, there's something that feels a little bit repellent to her, or like she can't quite assimilate it. And I think that was a tension I wanted to explore, sort of like when does this desire for narrative coherence of the life and of the universe, where has it gone too far for her, and where will she go no further?
We're going to open up to questions. Does anyone have one right off the bat? I will ask another buffer question unless someone has a question. Yes. I will
was just
repeat.
curious about it's kind of a little parable of the most popular kid on campus, and if that came from experience or if it was just something you came up with.
Okay, the question, as I understand it, is there is a parable of the most popular kid on campus. Is that how you put it? And if that came from experience. And I think so you've read the book? Yes. Okay, so I think you're referring not to Eva, but to a friend of hers, right? Who's,
Well, there's somebody who's the most popular person on campus but has face blindness.
Oh, okay. Yes, so in the book, okay, thanks for reminding me. There are a few popular people here. Right, there's a parable in the book of someone who's a really popular kid on campus, but it turns out that he doesn't really know, you can
Right.
explain,
He
who's
has-
been interacting with this whole time, all his acolytes, he doesn't know who they are, basically, his face blindness. Does that come from experience?
It doesn't. I do. I should wear glasses, and I don't, and so I often I'm approximating a type of face bias. I was also never the most popular kid. No, I don't know. I mean, in short, it's invented. But another crucial piece of this is he's not letting on that he has face blindness. So everyone who thinks they're his dear friend, it's a delusion, and this is very upsetting for Jamie, who's the one who experiences it, and becomes a real catalyst for his sort of peeling away from his own college environment and the sort of false collectivity that it represents.
Does anyone else have a question? You're going to have questions. I will keep asking buffer questions until they come. Okay, someone think of a question, because I have another question. You're going to start thinking of them. Just think of a question. So one of the things, I keep saying one of the things I love about this book, because there are like many, many things I love about this book. But one of those many things is this is a really touching and moving portrait of, I'm coming back to the only child, of a family. And I think this is true even of all of you who aren't only children, what it means to kind of like be in that family unit and grow up and out of it, and the family unit seems to go on without you, and you're kind of supposed to fit back into it when you come home, and so maybe you don't want to come home, and what do you do with those feelings? And the reason I really love your portrait of this is that it feels true, and also Eva is so sensitive to it. She is really sensitive to her parents in a way that's very touching. She doesn't want to like disappoint them or let them down or cause a conflict with them. Honestly, maybe she should sometimes. But she sees, her view of them changes. And, were there any literary models that you look to in writing that kind of relationship? Because I don't think it's explored. It is explored, but with this kind of delicacy, not always.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this idea of, coming to see your parents as real people, we hear about that all the time. And I'm sure there are many portraits of that. I feel like what's going on for Eva is slightly more subtle. It's not really like, oh, they're human after all, because she has, at least from the time we meet her, like apprehended them as people with, fallibilities, and she's always got a kind of like critical eye toward them. But I think it has more to do maybe with a sensitivity toward like what they want or need from her, and kind of a dawning awareness of the reciprocity in that relationship. And maybe this is a version of realizing her parents are real people who need things from her. But it's helpful in her case that she has this contrast with basically her parents. This is not a huge spoiler, like sort of end up Jamie goes and lives with her parents. And I think that makes certain things helpfully stark for her that she'd not realized before. And her parents are just extremely nice, normal people, fairly unobjectionable. But there's nothing like having your parents, rescue somebody else to suddenly, make totally good or good enough care feel like maybe not enough. So yeah, there's a lot going on there.
There's so much going on there. Who's thought of a question? Yes.
So there you mentioned that Eva understands herself as somebody who, if somebody just asked her the right question, then her life would fall into place. Like everything would make sense. And there's probably no such question, but like as her creator, what do you think is something that might come close at whatever stage in her life?
Did you guys hear that? Would you like it repeated? Okay.
Oh, I was gonna have you repeat it and give me a minute to think. Okay. What would the question that would sort of unlock everything for Eva? No, I don't think it. I think it really doesn't exist. And that's the elusive nature of her quest. Like thinking there is any singular question she's already on the wrong foot from there.
I have a question for her. And I think it's the question of the book in a lot of ways, and it's the question for everyone, which is when will you take possession of your life? I think that the book itself is a really beautiful answer to that question, and that is a question that's a classic question for the novel to answer in many different forms, in many different ways. That's like kind of one of the big novel questions, and I think one of the beauties of this book is that it shows someone really trying to like not only answer it but work their way to asking it.
Yes, which I think is I don't know what percentage of the work, but a good amount of it. I think it's true. I also think that like part of what she is grappling with and needs to grapple with and does end up figuring out in a large way is like how does she want what's the self-possessed way in which to interact with other people, right? Like she is seeking connectivity, and I don't think that is a fruitless quest. She is looking for alternatives to the self, and it's sort of a roundabout way, like self-possession by way of figuring out your relationship to the other.
Mm-hmm. I saw a second hand. Yes, that hand that I saw.
So I wanted to ask you about novel versus short stories, because I remember you once said that you were sort of a short story writer at heart, and if you could just do that forever, you would do that. And I was really surprised because I haven't read the book, and I thought probably this book is going to be just episodes in episodes. You're going to just like, and when I heard that it was like from being from teenage years all the way to what we call young adulthood, I was really surprised. I thought, wow, that's a really huge leap to take from short story instances to someone's basically life story. And I wanted to know how did that even, like what challenges were there? I mean, how did you think of that? And yeah.
Great question. And the question, I think you guys heard it, but the question is going from short story, a form that Clare has mastered, to the novel, another form that she has now mastered. How did that happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do find novel writing much harder, which is maybe obvious or maybe not. I don't know. I knew that the very simple difference between a short story and a novel is one is a lot longer, and I did know that if I was going to be taking on this longer challenge, that I wanted time to be the central element, and the thing that I was like really exploring over the course of it. I try to mess around with time in short stories to better and worse effect. But the key thing here was like taking this friendship, which as I say feels kind of like the main character in the book to me, and watching it change over time, and watching to see how it weathered change and the sort of separation of the characters in the friendship. So that was both the real pleasure of the novel, was like watching that unfold, and because I'm a writer who does not have sort of predetermined ends in mind, there is real pleasure in like finding out what happens. I don't know, people don't talk enough about how it's suspenseful to write as well as suspenseful to read, and that was a real source of the momentum and energy in the book for me. It was like, what's gonna change? This is the whole point. And you know, feeling, as I think we as readers and characters also feel, is like a feeling of sometimes wanting time to speed up and sometimes wanting it to slow down, and sort of being able to attend to how that changed my relationship with the narrative was also really interesting. And sometimes it got totally like, you know, you never have to have a timeline when you're writing a short story. And it was very new to me to have to like actually have dates written down. You have to keep track of things. Hard. God forbid I write nonfiction.
We can take one or two more. Please don't be shy.
I have a sort of silly question, which is I personally love names and naming, and I happen to know you do as well. And so I'm curious how you chose the main characters' names, or any smaller characters who you either struggled with or really enjoyed naming.
Great question, not silly.
It's another choice that is somewhat like the chapter headings. Really intuitive to me, often feels really inexplicably wrong, and then you just got to change something. Yeah, it's a totally ineffable thing to me. But this is Alice, and there is an Alice in the books.
There it is? Great.
Read on to photos.
Yes.
So I haven't read the book, but it seems clear that it's a friendship at the center as opposed to a romantic relationship. And I'm curious if you always knew that it was going to be a friendship at the center of the novel, and if so, why you made that choice.
Yeah, great question. The strictly true answer, well, I was not totally sure. There have been many versions of this novel, and there were some where the line between friendship and romance was blurrier, and I don't imagine that question to be hovering over this version of the novel. I will be curious to find out if that's the case for readers. I do think it's a love story. So in that sense, the question doesn't feel as operative to me as it otherwise might. I think because of what I was describing about sort of this being about like whether people can weather change together. That's the type of love story that's maybe a little bit less exhilarating to read, or it has less to do with falling in love and more to do with staying in love. So it's that type of love story. But I think that, I don't know, maybe that's the love story of a lot of friendships. And so I was really drawn to the idea of a platonic friendship where, I don't know, romantic questions are certainly involved, but not stated as such, not out of some avoidant reason, but just because, I don't know, romance underlies so many relationships where we're not really talking about it directly. So that is certainly something I wanted to explore.
Well, thank you all so much, and thank you, Claire. Tonight. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. Thank you to Alex for moderating such a wonderful conversation. And thank you, Claire, for celebrating this launch with us. So, just a few quick reminders before I wrap up. If you're still with us on the YouTube live stream, you can buy a copy by clicking the link in the live stream description. For those of you with us tonight, we have some additional copies available for purchase at the registry where you checked in. We also have some copies of Claire's short story collection, Objects of Desire, which is lovely and paperback and looks great next to this cover. So I highly recommend checking that one out as well. Claire will be around to sign and personalize your books. Again, that will be happening where the drinks used to be, where my coworkers are now pointing to. There are 2 beers left now on the register. Feel free to help yourself. But again, that's where she'll be signing. We please ask that you grab all of your personal belongings with you, line up down the center aisle and curve around to the wall so we can start to break down the space. And please make sure that your cups and your cans end up in the trash can next to the blue cart. That is very helpful. All right, that's all for tonight. Let's give these two one last round of applause. Thank you all again.